In a depressed state or in an anxious state, your brain has learned to make automatic associations between different things. Imagine you see someone laughing in public. Someone with anxiety or depression may automatically assume these people are laughing at me because I'm a loser or because I look weird or something like that. What I see exercise to do is it allows your brain to enter almost this neuroplastic state where you're more amenable to unlearn some things, and you may see additional benefits in things like therapy when you're going there and able to unlearn some of these wired thought patterns. When depressed, when in this increased metabolic state, your body's processes to make energy through the form of ATP are impaired. And this is where creatine comes in, and it's able to essentially quickly replace that ATP or energy level within the brain to help with some of the symptoms of depression.
Nicholas, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, I'm excited to have you on the show. And on X or Twitter, I see you post a lot about the effects of creatine and exercise and mental health, which is very popular right now, with creatine having shown to be more than just a muscle building supplement. There's a lot of research about the brain benefits, but many people aren't aware that it also has mental health benefits, and you've written some nice papers about this, reviewing those effects. So yeah, we'll be talking all things about mental health with the fundamentals of improving mental health with some exercise and creatine, some other things. So we'll have a good discussion.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I think, it's definitely been an interesting area that's been developing from both the creatine and exercise side. And like you said, I think traditionally we've more seen creatine to be this fitness supplement for muscles, and there's been a paradigm shift recently where we're being more interested beyond even mental health, but just the brain gains, for lack of a better word, for creatine. But I think a big question that remains is, what is the optimal dosing protocol? What are the expected benefits? Because there are hundreds, if not thousands, of papers from a physical performance perspective, but there is only very preliminary literature for cognition and mental health. And most of the mental health literature for creatine is, again, largely focused on depression. And that's kind of how we usually see a lot of different studies come out, is first starting with the less of the quote unquote severe mental illness, where we start with depression, and then we move on to other things like schizophrenia and such. But it's very exciting to see it starting up.
Yeah, what was maybe you can give an overview about the recent paper you made about creatine?
Yeah, so with the recent paper, we published it in the European Neuropsychopharmacology, and essentially what we did was provided a brief overview of how creatine may work in depression and highlighted some of the key trials that have been conducted so far. So in that paper, to speak from a clinical lens first, we highlighted two trials that were completed with creatine. And the first one, what they did was essentially pair creatine with an antidepressant agent, and they compared it to just placebo plus the antidepressant. And what they found was that there was a pretty early response where we saw antidepressant effects as early as 2 weeks, more so than that of the antidepressant alone, which is very promising because in psychiatry and mental health, we know that these antidepressant agents can take a long time to have an effect and sometimes don't even have a noticeable effect after many, many weeks. So if there's an agent that can be paired with some of these treatments to help, I think that's very promising. And that was repeated in a number of other trials where they paired creatine with an antidepressant and saw improved antidepressant response. But one of the newer trials that came out was just in 2025, again in European Neuropsychopharmacology, by Sherpa et al., and they combined creatine with cognitive behavioral therapy. And this is one of the first-line therapies for the treatment of depression. And they found a very similar effect where at the end of 8 weeks, there was an improved antidepressant benefits. And what we did was, in this paper, beyond just summarizing some of the results of it, we also wanted to speak mechanistically in terms of maybe what is creatine doing in the brain. And from that, the way we framed it was very similar to muscle. We know that creatine, it's stored as something called phosphocreatine within the muscles. And that essentially allows your muscles to reuse energy when needed. So when exercising or when, running, weightlifting, all these different things. So what we proposed was a very similar mechanism in the brain, that something is happening along the same lines, where when you're in a depressed state or when you're in a sleep-deprived state, your body's in this state of increased metabolic demand. Where creatine comes in is it's able to store in the brain, very similar to the muscle, as phosphocreatine, providing this backup system for energy. So the thought process is, when depressed, when in this increased metabolic state, your body's processes to make energy through the form of ATP are impaired. So we need to rely on some of these backup systems. And this is where creatine comes in, and it's able to essentially quickly replace that ATP or energy level within the brain to help with some of the symptoms of depression. So again, whether that's low energy, whether that's poor concentration.
Mm.
And that's really the thought behind it. But then a lot of questions come up from there because we know that most creatine goes to the muscles, and we know that we need likely a higher dose to get into the brain and for a longer duration of time. And these aforementioned trials that I referred to, they use pretty low doses, so just 5 grams per day, which is your standard sort of fitness dose. And it was only 8-week long trials. So both of those two things, I think there are room for optimization for future trials. And that was just kind of the point we made there. And again, the big point was summarizing some of the recent trials, but also providing a little bit of that mechanistic lens.
Mm. Yeah. So it's almost like the increased energy, the ability to, let's say, act in the world from creatine that would mitigate the symptoms of depression, which makes you withdraw from the world. So it's almost like, depressed people don't have the desire or motivation to do things that would reduce their depression, like exercise and those kind of things. But with creatine, you're giving yourself this short energy boost that would make them want to do those things, if I get it correctly.
Yeah, and I like to think of it similar to the physical realm, where you're able to do more physical reps, whether it's your bench pressing, whether you're running. I see it as creatine gives you that little bit of an extra buffer for mental reps. So by no means is it saying that depression is a creatine deficiency. More so is to say that, depression and some of the symptoms that are associated with depression may benefit from that energy buffer. And we're actually seeing an increasing interest in conceptualizing depression through more of what we call a bioenergetic lens than the more traditional view of depression, which has been just low serotonin causes depression, which we know now isn't the case. But I think at a large population level, many people still have the belief that, I'm depressed just because my serotonin is low, and this is why antidepressants work. But we know it's much, much more complex than that.
Yeah, is there anything else that creatine does, maybe to the neurotransmitters or anything like that, to have an effect on depression or mood?
Yeah, it's hard to say at the neurotransmitter level because there's not a lot of mechanistic studies looking at it, specifically even within depression. But we do know that creatine can even have some anti-inflammatory effects, which we know for depression, whether that's unipolar or bipolar, has potentially a causative role. And even recent literature has suggested that some of the depression subtypes may fit under more of this inflammatory depression. So it's an area of research that's very nascent. There's a lot still to be done, but I think it's very exciting because having more treatment options for depression makes sense because we know depression is one term, but there's thousands and thousands of different ways of defining it, and it presents uniquely in each different person. So I think via that lens, having different treatment options, whether it's creatine, whether it's exercise, allows for more personalized care and more of a symptoms-based approach than a diagnosis-based approach.
Yeah. Another condition that's characterized by this high inflammation and oxidative stress is TBI, so traumatic brain injury. And there is actually some research that creatine helps with, I guess, filling the gap in that energy in the brain that would happen under TBI. I don't know if you've seen those studies.
Yeah, it's actually interesting. I know you had Darren on the show before. We're actually writing up a paper conceptualizing. So TBI was under this umbrella, but referring to the point that I made before, where we probably need higher doses to have those brain benefits. And the same thing probably applies for TBI. And the study that we mentioned in that paper that we had written up and will be published soon, essentially looked at giving children that had TBI creatine, and I believe it was 10 grams per day for a prolonged period of time. And they actually had pretty severe TBI, so they were in the ICU or the intensive care unit because of that. And they found that creatine had a lot of benefits to cognitive, but also functional outcomes. And there are even associations with getting out of the ICU faster. So I think, like you said, it's applicable beyond just depression, this bioenergetic lens that we look at different disorders, and even traumatic brain injury can be conceptualized via this state of altered brain bioenergetics, but also altered brain creatine metabolism. So I think across disorders, there is applications, and it extends beyond the realm of mental health.
Yeah, that's interesting. 10 grams for children is quite high. What would be the equivalent dose for adults?
Yeah, so it's hard to make a direct comparison between the two. And the reason is when we're looking at creatine doses, some of these studies do weight based, so gram per kilogram of body weight. But even that isn't necessarily an accurate one-to-one comparison, because to really ideally see what someone's unique dose would need, you would almost need a DEXA scan to see what is their muscle composition, what is their lean body mass, and it's very complex. And specifically within children, we know that their body types and proportions can vary so widely, even more so sometimes than adults. So it's hard to say a one-to-one comparison. And the thing is, a lot of these studies, they're using varying doses, usually on the lower end. But I think we're going to start seeing higher and higher doses from the brain perspective. And we've seen a handful, specifically in the lens of sleep deprivation as well, too, which have been promising.
I want to take a quick break to let you know about my favorite wellness devices, which are the Bond Charge red light therapy devices. You've probably seen many of your favorite longevity influencers using these red light therapy devices, but do they actually work? Yes, they do. Red light therapy has been shown to have many benefits on skin anti-aging, hormone optimization, pain management, and even exercise performance. I use my device every day for 15 minutes, especially during the winter months when there's not much sunlight. It increases my energy in the morning and makes my skin glow. Just check out the testimonials on the Bond Charge website for the before and after pictures of other people. Most red light therapy devices don't have the right wavelengths of light, which might mean you're not getting the claimed benefits. Bond Charge uses the exact wavelengths of light used in research, and they also have near-infrared light that's beneficial to the joints. Head over to bondcharge.com and use the code SIIM, S-I-I-M, for a 15% discount.
Is there any effect on like anxiety or some other like mental health conditions?
So not necessarily anxiety through the lens of generalized anxiety or social anxiety, like the more traditional ones that we would describe in clinical practice, but a disorder that falls under the realm of anxiety and not anymore in the newest edition of the DSM, but post-traumatic stress disorder. They looked at supplementing people. It was an open label trial with creatine, and again, found some benefits to PTSD related symptoms. So some of those can be related to what we would describe more traditionally as anxiety, so the hypervigilance or always feeling on edge and stuff like that. So there are some benefits outside. And as I mentioned before, there was even a trial using creatine in people with schizophrenia. And again, an open label trial, not a randomized control trial. And what they found was benefits to some of the symptoms of schizophrenia. And they supplemented them with, I believe it was 10 grams per day for about 6 months. And this was an inpatient sample, so people that were in hospital. So again, not necessarily saying that creatine is going to cure schizophrenia or ever replace some of the agents that we use to treat schizophrenia. But I think it has a role because in schizophrenia specifically, one of the ways we're not really good at treating is the negative symptoms. And these are the persistent cognitive symptoms or lowering of someone's mood. So when we treat someone with antipsychotic agents and we stop those hallucinations or delusional thought patterns, sometimes you're left with someone that has a lot of this amotivation or decreased mood, and it's not really fully accounted for. So I think supplements like creatine may have some utility here to help treat some of those residual symptoms. So yeah, those are some of the other areas, and it's still a very nascent area, but exciting to see.
Gotcha. Would anyone with, let's say, no depression get any prophylactic effect if they are supplementing creatine? Is there any like research about that?
Yeah, so not from a supplementing lens, but there was a study that looked at dietary creatine and looked at depression at a population level. So essentially what they did was they separated the creatine intake based on diet, based on the NHANES survey in the US. And they broke it up, I believe, into quintiles or quartiles. I'm forgetting right now, but they found essentially an association between higher creatine intake and having a lower risk of having depression. So that to me is very promising. But in that study, they did exclude people that were supplementing creatine. And this is a very important caveat because we know dietary creatine has much lower levels than those people that are supplementing. So to get a single scoop's worth or 5 grams of creatine, you need to have about 3 pounds of red meat. So unless you're on a carnivore diet, you're going to be having a hard time keeping up with someone who's supplementing 5 or 10 grams of creatine per day. So I think it's a very interesting signal to see that potentially there's a protective effect through a dietary lens. But to my knowledge, there's no study looking at a protective effect for mental health via a supplementation lens.
Yeah, we mentioned earlier that creatine will increase the person's, I guess, so energy and willingness to move around and be active. How big, is that the effect coming from the exercise, or is it just from the creatine? Is there any way to differentiate that? Where does this antidepressive effect come from? Because exercise, we generally think these are good for depression and mood.
Yeah. So I guess to break up the question into 2 points. So the exercise point, we know exercise alone, even minus creatine, looking at the large scale meta-analysis when you bring studies together, has equivalent antidepressant effects to therapy and medication. So that's even without the creatine. And then when you add into the creatine to that, it's hard to really tease the two out. And the reason being is twofold. So number one, there are no trials adding creatine plus exercise together for the treatment of depression yet. We've actually applied for a grant to hopefully set up a trial looking at creatine plus resistance training or weightlifting for depression. So that will help tease out maybe which effect is happening where, and if the creatine in isolation can actually have an effect. But it's hard to say exactly what creatine is contributing through that lens. But it's all to say, exercise has these major antidepressant effects. It seems like creatine is an effective adjunctive treatment, and combining the two would hopefully have a synergistic effect through that lens.
Gotcha. Why does exercise have antidepressive effects, and why does it improve mood?
Yeah. So I think that's a nice and big question. So I'll break that one down too. Is first off, before I describe mechanism of exercise's antidepressant effect, I always like to bring back to the original problem that we have, that we actually don't know what causes depression. So to say that we know what cures depression would be hard because we don't necessarily know what causes it. And to go back to what I originally had mentioned before with the serotonin hypothesis of depression, we know that no longer is depression the state of just being low serotonin, and you just need to have that replaced, sort of thing. But what we know that exercise does is a number of things. So I like to break it down through what's called like a biopsychosocial model. So bio is when we talk about those neurotransmitters, brain changes, physical health changes. Social is, what's happening at the social level, and psychological is what's happening in your mind, sort of thing. So to break it down via those lens, biologically, which is what most people are interested in, we know that exercise can upregulate some of those neurotransmitters that are implicated in depression. So serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, we see increases with exercise. We also know that exercise, and the muscles specifically, can function almost as endocrine organs, where the muscle can communicate with the brain via what we call myokines. One of the important myokines is something called BDNF, or brain-derived neurotrophic factor. And a lot of people call that the miracle grow for the brain. So we know that's important because depression, as I mentioned before, is the state of increased metabolic demand. It can be very hard on your brain. So to have something counteracting that would likely have some antidepressant benefits. And we actually see changes in people's brain when they exercise. So increases in the size of the hippocampus, which is an area that's important for memory. And then the other point that I had alluded to before from the lens of creatine, but we know exercise also decreases inflammation. So both peripheral, but central in the brain, which is implicated in depression and severity of depression. So that's through that biological lens. And there's a number of other things there too. You could read endless papers of mechanisms and stuff of that sort. But one thing that I think is under-recognized is the social lens.
Right.
Particularly for older individuals, exercise can be a time of just being with someone else, whether you're going to the gym, whether you're going for a run in a run club or something, whether you're on a sports team. This may be the only time that someone's actually seeing someone in person. And particularly, as I mentioned, for older individuals that maybe are widowed and don't have a lot of family. And that social connection we know is so important for people, and having that sense of community. And even in isolation, removing the exercise, we know how toxic it is to be in an isolated environment and not to have that support. So I think the social realm is very important for exercise too. And then psychologically, a way that I like to look at it, and it kind of meshes in the biological lens, but exercise we know can induce neuroplasticity within the brain. What that means, people usually look at it through the lens of learning. Your brain can learn new things and adapt. I like to look at it through the lens of unlearning. In a depressed state or in an anxious state, your brain has learned to make automatic associations between different things. So imagine you see someone laughing in public. Someone with anxiety or depression may automatically assume these people are laughing at me because I'm a loser or because I look weird or something like that. What I see exercise to do is it allows your brain to enter almost this neuroplastic state where you're more amenable to unlearn some things. And you may see additional benefits in things like therapy when you're going there and able to unlearn some of these wired thought patterns. So I think through all of these lenses, we see the benefit of exercise. And again, going back to my original point of we don't even know what causes depression, but we know there's a variety of mechanisms that help with the antidepressant benefit via the exercise lens.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting because like one of the characteristics of depression is this rumination on negative or like negative image of yourself or negative events, ruminating about those things. So unwinding that rumination, making it more neuroplastic might help to unwire some of those ruminating patterns.
Yeah, no, I agree with that for sure.
You mentioned that, or at least one impression I got was that depression is almost like a similar disease you are diagnosed with as like diabetes that imposes certain negative effects on your physiology, like this increased energy demand in the brain and inflammation. The same way with diabetes. But diabetes is obviously more like a scale that we all have a certain amount of blood sugar in our bloodstream, and after a certain threshold, it is diagnosed as diabetes. So if it's chronically elevated, and there's certain numbers for fasting blood sugar and your oral glucose tolerance test, etc., that is diagnosed as diabetes. But there is obviously like a normal level of blood sugar for survival and health. Is the same with depression, that there is a scale that maybe someone might have like some depressive episodes or symptoms, but it's not diagnosed as depression yet.
Yeah, so I think in just the normal human experience, I think it's important to feel some of those bad, or what we would deem to be called bad emotions. So, if you lose a loved one, or if something bad happens in your life, you lose your job, you're going to feel sad, right? And sometimes that's important to have that sense of community. An example would be something like grief. When you lose someone that's in your family or something, it's almost innate and human nature to be able to feel that sadness. And what people sometimes describe after being on an antidepressant is rather than feeling sad, there's more an essence of feeling numb. So the inability to feel that high or low. So I think, to go back to your question, I think yes, it's almost very similar to diabetes, where yes, there are blood glucose levels that can be used to diagnose, and other symptoms that pair that, like if you're eating more, if you're drinking more, going to the washroom more. And I do think it falls on this continuum of normal emotion and getting into this depressed state, where I like to draw it in. There's a million of different definitions of depression, whether it's the DSM, whether it's the ICD. My important thing is just speaking to the person in front of you and seeing, is this causing functional impairment? If you're having these feelings of feeling low, lack of motivation, sleep deprivation, is this impairing your ability to live the life the way that you want to? And if so, then let's do something about it. Because I think sometimes we get too stuck under the lens of the DSM says this is how we diagnose depression. You now have depression. We should start you on an antidepressant. You should do therapy. And the problem is what I mentioned before, where depression can be defined so many different ways. And even two people that have the exact same number of symptoms can have such a different severity level of symptoms. So someone's depression can be heavily driven by sleep problems. You can imagine if in isolation, you're sleeping 3 hours a night, you're super tired all the time, you can't get your work done properly, all these different things. By fixing that small node of insomnia, you may resolve the whole depression. And does that insomnia necessarily need a medication? Maybe not. Right. So I think that's where we kind of are led astray in our training, and we operate based on diagnoses. And it goes back to your point where, yes, I do think it's important for people to be able to feel sad and feel happy. And I do think it falls on the spectrum. But I think there's more utility individualizing our approach and seeing, what does this person's depression look like in front of you, and what factors can we modify? So whether creatine may help, maybe exercise, maybe medications, maybe therapy, maybe all of them together. But I think we need to speak to the person in front of us and see how that evolves, rather than just having a very simplistic approach of depression means medication. I think that's where we fall short in psychiatry.
Yeah, sometimes it's just sleep deprivation. Other times it's B12 deficiency or lack of sunlight or something like that manifests as symptoms of depression. But is it like so you're not going to get diabetes overnight? So typically it's going to be a long process of chronically elevated blood sugar over the course of many years. With depression, is it also similar that before you actually get fully diagnosed with depression, or you fully meet all the criteria of depression, is there like a slow trickle away that like you might feel a bit sad or down after a week of bad sleep, but if it doesn't keep compounding, then it doesn't like happen overnight, or is it like something like that?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of factors that go into it. So I think that these chronic stressors, but I think there's also beyond that, there's genetic, there are personality traits that maybe make you more vulnerable. So you can imagine two people going through the exact same situation. Let's say they both lost their job, the same outcome, same everything. That doesn't mean that necessarily both people will become depressed. And that doesn't mean that person A or person B is any less of a person because one does or does not become depressed. But it's just to say that there are a lot of personality vulnerabilities and genetic vulnerabilities that may predispose someone to go on and develop that depression. So for sure, you can have maybe person A who lost their job and they're sad, they're having a hard time, but they start noticing this and maybe they seek help early, they start exercising, they start taking control of that. Maybe that prevents from slipping into that full-on depressive episode. Whereas maybe for person B, the same circumstance happens, but that progression happens and there's no intervention and it kind of spirals into this full-blown depression. And we know that the longer this depressive episode is going on, the harder it is to treat and the more, toxic it is for your brain. The more of these episodes you have, the more likely you are to have another, and the more likely you are to have other different disorders. So whether it's anxiety or even things like dementia, we know that people that have recurrent episodes of depression throughout their life are at an increased risk of dementia too. So it shows you how harmful even something as simple as depression can be on the brain, and how differently life circumstances can affect someone to either go on to a full-blown episodes of depression or to kind of have a bump in the road and be able to kind of continue along the way.
Yeah, that's interesting. You can have some death of a loved one or some very, very serious life event that happens, death of a child or something like that. And obviously, many people would consider that an adequate reason to go into depression. But there are some people who don't, because of genetics, or maybe they have a bigger bucket for stress or depression, whereas other people might have their bucket already filled up with sleep deprivation and other problems. So it kind of shows that you always have the opportunity to fight back against depression or make yourself immune against depression, or reduce the likelihood of yourself getting depressed with your lifestyle and even just the perception of the world. I would imagine that your mindset about things, like one great book about it is not specifically about depression, but Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. So he's like a Holocaust survivor, and just being able to reframe the experience had like a very powerful effect on their ability to survive.
No, it's a great point you make, and I think that's why in our current society we have so much emphasis on treatment. So beyond depression, even for schizophrenia, and each year you see these novel fancy drugs come out that cost billions and billions of dollars to develop, and oftentimes don't have a whole lot of different of effect compared to some of the existing ones. But I think we do a disservice in terms of prevention. So those go to some of the things like you mentioned, to if you're able to optimize someone's lifestyles, whether that's their exercise habits, whether that's their sleeping habits, whether that's even on a large scale like dietary habits, and that these can have interventions at a policy level too, to ensure people are more active, to ensure people are eating healthier, to place priority on high quality sleep. Then you can have someone that has more of this reserve, and to your analogy of the bucket, their bucket is now less full, so they can handle more stressors. And that's not to say that nothing will fill up that bucket. There are things in life that no matter how prepared you are, that bucket is going to overflow. But it's to say that it can give you that much more reserve to function. So if there is something filling up that bucket, you can continue to move forward, and even use that as to the other example you showed, where reframing your mindset on different things too is very powerful too. But that also requires a lot of cognitive reserve to be able to have that and to be able to reframe a very difficult situation for someone who may already feel very beat down. So that's why for the lens that I see, I think we need to do a lot better of a job on prevention. And that can be via some of these lifestyle measures that we know are so important for not just our mental health, but also our physical health.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Circling back to exercise, so is there any research about the different types of exercise and how long and frequency?
Yeah, so they've done a few meta-analyses which is again where they bring the studies together to say which exercise is the best. And the overall theme is that there's not necessarily a clear winner. We like to break up exercise into resistance, which is things like weightlifting, aerobic, which is things like running, or mind body, which are things like yoga. And among these three categories, you can imagine there's a lot of overlap between different sports and things, but there's not necessarily a clear winner. The most important fact seems to be adherence. So is someone going to actually commit to whatever exercise regimen they want to do, and will they continue to do it? And it's very similar to a diet where if you prescribe someone this perfect diet that costs $1,000 a meal, it's super high nutrients, but it takes hours and hours to make, they're probably not going to be able to do that because it's not sustainable for them from that front. So I think that's where we need to use the same lens for exercise to say, what does this person in front of us actually want to do, and what is sustainable for them to continue to engage in? The only general association we see with exercise is with its association with intensity. So we traditionally see higher intensity exercise to have greater antidepressant benefits. And again, there are caveats to that too. So particularly within the older populations, we like to break intensity into mild, moderate, and vigorous. But for older populations, it's more on this side to the mild, moderate. And it's likely due to some of the reserve that they have in their body, and also more likely to become injured. If you can imagine, if you're 90 years old doing a vigorous marathon run or something, you might not get as many antidepressant effects if you're actually injuring your body too. So I think it's, again, the underlying thing is adherence, something that's sustainable for you, and to an intensity level that you are able to enjoy and derive some of those benefits from.
Gotcha. Yeah, so sprinting is a good form of exercise in terms of the antidepressive effects. And I think, if someone does do a lot of, let's say, a few bouts of sprinting, then the elevation in mood is quite noticeable, at least in my experience.
Yeah, and I think that's a point from that too, is with exercise, you can use it as motivation. So starting low is always the goal, because you can imagine someone who is currently depressed, they're not going to go from being sedentary, not moving at all, and now running a 42-kilometer marathon or something like that. They're going to need to start low and build up from there. But like you said, after that one bout of exercise, you can already start to notice some of that almost motivation immediately after, or even during that exercise. And that's what you can really use to build up. So maybe next session, you run a little bit further or at a little bit higher intensity, and you just keep building up from there, rather than setting these objectives that you need to reach. Because I guess, to speak to your first point again, there are parameters that we know that are better for antidepressant benefits. So we spoke about intensity. There's not a clear winner for the type of exercise. We know frequency, the benefit is usually between 3 to 5 times per week. And then the timing of these sessions usually aim between 45 to 60 minutes. But you can imagine that this varies a lot based on sprints. You're not going to sprint for 45 or 60 minutes. That's just not sustainable. So the literature is very sparse in this area in terms of what is the best, but I actually think it's for the better that we don't have a clear answer there. Otherwise, with prescribing and guidelines, we would become so fixated on, you need to do this, you need to do that. And for someone with depression, that's not very helpful. It's more so, like I mentioned, adherence and building up over time, because those initial antidepressant benefits from going from not moving at all to even moving a little bit are exponential and continue that way.
Gotcha. Yeah. What if someone exercises, too much or every day a lot?
And I actually wrote a paper on that, I think a year ago now. It was more through the lens of depression, of is exercise a form of self-harm, or can exercise be a form of self-harm? And I think yes, in some instances. And particularly in people that have more of this exercise dependence, there's one thing to have exercise as a positive coping mechanism, or just a hobby that you're doing. But then there's another realm where if exercise is becoming this thing that you need to do in order to function, And it can even be attached to some maladaptive thoughts around body image or needing to expend a certain amount of energy to offset food intake. It
Right.
can become unhealthy, and this can then contribute to some of the depression sort of effects. And in the paper that I had written about, I asked the question too, could exercise even be a form of self-harm? So when I speak about self-harm, the traditional things are things like cutting or burning and things that we see of that sort. But we never really think of exercise as a form of self-harm outside of the eating disorder sort of population. But, in speaking to a lot of athletes and different people, it seems that, when people are going through hard times, sometimes they use exercise almost to feel that pain. They want to go to the gym and feel the pain in their muscles or run excessively far to feel the pain, to change that emotional pain into a physical pain. And in my eyes, society reinforces that. So if you go to your doctor and say, I'm having a hard time, I'm exercising so much, they're going to say, great. You're going to tell your friends that, they're going to say, great. And most of the time, that is probably a good thing. But I think in some instances, if it's being used through the lens of self-harm, it can be this counterproductive behavior that is harmful to the person that is now being reinforced. And you have this pocket of people that are not being seen by even their psychiatrist because it's being reinforced as this only good thing. So I think we need to see the other perspective too. Although my view remains that exercise is largely a positive thing, I think that there is a class of people that have exercise dependence and even people that may be using it as a form of self-harm that also warrants discussion and opening that conversation. Because that curve that I alluded to where you're going from sedentary to just moving a bit, having the benefits, it does taper off eventually. And there is a thing, as you mentioned, of too much exercise. So I think it's an important counterpoint to the discussion because, again, I love that exercise is always praised and how amazing it is. And I think it is. But I think we also need to be aware of the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. So exercise dependence, they need exercise to either burn enough calories to not gain weight or to maintain good mood. So would it be that some people need more exercise to not get depressed and to not get low mood? Or is it, and is it also like then that if you are, let's say you have your bucket is starting to overflow because of, maybe there was a tragic life event or something like that, you need more exercise to offset that bigger traumatic event and bigger depression surge. Whereas maybe after a while, after a few months, that I guess the symptoms of the depression would go away, or you get over some of the trauma or the tragedy, and then you also need less exercise. So is it along those lines that the exercise, the bigger requirement for exercise to feel normal mentally would come from all these other things that increase the depression bucket?
No, I think it's a great analogy. I think in hard life events, so you often see in when people go through breakups and things like that, they have their gym arc where they start going to the gym more and they're working out more and stuff like that. And I think some of these things can be viewed as a positive thing where you're taking some of that negative energy, putting it in the gym, and you're hoping to get some of those bad emotions out. And like you mentioned, in a state where maybe their bucket is more filled and maybe they're at the verge of actually tipping into a major depressive episode, maybe this allows them to offset that. And as you mentioned, over time, as they get out of that, maybe they can not exercise as much and they can be able to function. I think the defining factor comes from, again, that functional impairment. When this person is doing these activities and everything, are they still able to tend to the other areas of their life? Are they still able to, if they're in school, perform well in school? If they're in other sports teams and stuff like that, can they still do that? If they have other commitments or relationships or family members, can they uphold that? But if it's all going into one bucket and it's becoming functionally impairing, or if it's through the lens of more of an eating disorder lens where I need to exercise because I had 2 Rice Krispies instead of 1. Now I need to go for a really long run. This is where it starts becoming functionally impairing and more pathological. But it's a very individualized sort of look at it because you can cross-sectionally look at any person and say, oh, this person exercises 3 hours per day. Like this must be a problem. I mean, again, maybe it's on the verge of that, but you don't know until you talk to that person and see how are they able to function in other areas of life and how do they perceive it. And sometimes the person doesn't realize it themselves, specifically within eating disorders. They see the exercise as necessary to offset some of these caloric intakes. And that's where you need another perspective. But I think, again, it's about talking to the person in front of you and seeing how is this impacting their life.
Yeah. Would it So does the exercise dependence also apply to needing to exercise to just feel normal and happy? Because I think, we both agree that everyone should exercise, right? And so there should never be a time where you're not exercising for at least, several months or years of never exercising. But do you need to exercise to be happy, or should you not depend on the exercise in that sense?
Yeah, no, I think it is a fundamental pillar for a lot of people. So like what you eat, how you move, how you sleep, a lot of these factors you can say are causally dependent on how your mood state is or to be happy.
Right.
I think it becomes an issue where how I look at it is in life you should have several pillars that control not just your happiness, your mood, your cognition, such that it's not just one. And if you have one pillar and you're relying just on exercising and going to the gym today, then I'll be happy. Or if I go for my run, then I'll be happy. And once my run is done, I'm sad again. Then this is almost a sort of reinforcing behavior. And it can be akin sometimes to even substance use disorders, where you see people that use stimulants or different medications to feel that high. And then when it's not there, they're in that low again. And the same thing can even apply for exercise sometimes, where you need to run, go to the gym to feel that high. But over time, that high doesn't become a high. It becomes, I exercise to feel okay. Some people exercise and they feel on top of the world, and then that takes them throughout the day. But if you're now exercising to go from here to just feel okay and then go back down here, that's where it becomes more of this sort of dependence. And it's very similar to substance use disorders, where people become reliant at first on using like a stimulant because it makes them feel great. And then over time, it makes them feel less great. And then it becomes, without it, I can't function and I need to do it just to be okay. That's where I think it becomes functionally impairing. And that's why it's important to have other pillars. So whether it's lifestyle factors, whether it's social connections with people in your life, whether it's having meaning in your life because of your job or some goals that you have, these are all other factors that, I would hope are present in people's lives, so that when something comes by and knocks out one of those things that they have, they still have other pillars to rely on. And an example for myself is when I was in my first year of medical school, I actually broke my arm wrestling, and I was really getting to the gym at the time, and I have a nice scar right here from that. So when that happened, I was like, wow, because I think I was really relying on that pillar of just exercise. I really looked forward to it every day. I was really busy with school and everything. And when that pillar was knocked down, I was like, wow, like, what am I supposed to do now? And that's when I realized how important it is, like, you need to have multiple pillars. You can't just rely on that one thing. And I think lots of people fall in that exercise sort of dependent spectrum at one point in their lives, especially when you're getting into fitness and getting so, it's such a new thing and it's so fun that it becomes almost everything for a little bit. But that's where that dependence may start, and it can progress from there. So I think, a long-winded way just to say having a lot of pillars is very important, not just for your mood, but your overall health, and not relying just on one thing.
Yeah, and if you're injured, then it doesn't always have to be an actual workout. Just going for a walk, I think also is, if I were to be ever injured, I would still walk. And I think that, if you mentally acknowledge that, okay, this is, I'm injured, I can't do it right now, or you're traveling or whatever, like you just accept it, but I can still walk, then I think, for me at least, it would be enough that I still get to move a little bit and enjoy walking.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing, being able to adapt to different things too, because you never know what happens in life. You never know, even if you're traveling and stuff, right? You're not going to have access to the same utilities that you would have at home and stuff like that. So I think beyond just pillars outside of exercise, even having mini pillars within exercise of different things you like to do. Otherwise, you get too stuck on doing one thing. And when that one thing isn't there, then you're kind of lost of what to do next. So I think it's very important to have a lot of different options from that front.
Yeah, gotcha. So another maybe next pillar, diet. Is there anything specific about diet? So you mentioned creatine, dietary creatine. Any other important nutrients or things that people need to get?
So I think the largest focus of some of this stuff that I've looked at so far is not necessarily what to get, but more what not to get. And the most important thing that the literature has shown so far is ultra-processed foods. In America, for instance, over 50% of energy intake now comes from ultra-processed foods. And we know that these ultra-processed food intake is associated with depression, anxiety, and there's even been randomized control trials taking people in a depressed state that had a poor diet, so high ultra-processed foods, and then removing some of those foods And in the absence of even changes of medication, et cetera, they saw reductions in their depression scores. So I think we clearly have an association on a population level, but now we even have randomized control trial data to say ultra processed foods are, likely causing some of these depressive symptoms. And again, it probably goes both ways. When you're in a depressed state, we know that the brain is actually rewired to crave more carbs, more ultra processed foods. So it's not just to say that ultra processed foods just cause depression. It's likely that depression also causes increased intake of ultra processed foods.
Right.
But I think it's particularly an issue now because we're seeing such increase in the amount of ultra processed food. It's available to children, it's available to adolescents, it's available to adults. And we're also seeing a rise in depression. And again, not to just say because these two things are happening at once, they have to be associated, but with the aforementioned things that I had discussed, I think it's a pretty strong indicator. And there's a lot of mechanisms via the lens of inflammation, mitochondrial dysfunction, and all of these fancy buzzwords that we use for other different disorders that link the two. So I think from a dietary advice, it's important to try to avoid some of these ultra processed foods. It's not impossible. It's not possible to bring it down to zero, likely in our current society. But I think it's something that personally we need to be aware of, but also policy level, if there can be changes from that front.
Gotcha. Is it even independent of calorie intake? So let's say you eat one donut, but otherwise your diet is healthy and you're not gaining weight. Would it have an effect?
Yeah, so the literature is not as clear there, but my thought on this is the independent of calorie intake, by eating ultra-processed foods, through the lens of even nutrients, you're now replacing nutrients that you would get from whole foods and replacing it with ultra-processed foods. So your donut example, you could even eat a donut, and depending how big it is, maybe it's 500 calories. That's a pretty hefty amount of calories for someone's daily caloric intake.
Right.
Then that 500 calories, the amount of fruits and vegetables you need to eat to get that small donut, you could probably have a massive bowl of whole foods that would be full of fiber, full of nutrients and stuff. So that's important for your bowel. That's important from a micro and macronutrient level that helps your body essentially function. So independent of calories, I would say yes. The answer is that the ultra-processed foods do contribute to adverse mental health. And it's not just that they're more calories, although they are. We know, as I mentioned, it rewires the brain for you to want to eat more and you feel less full. So not only are you eating more calories, but you're eating less nutritious food, and it perpetuates this cycle. And I think that's where the problem of ultra-processed foods really lies, and why it's so pervasive in society too, because people eat them and they're frankly almost addicted to them too, more so than eating an apple or eating a carrot or something that may be healthier.
Yeah, gotcha. What is it in the processed food then? Is it does it cause inflammation? Is it some of the ingredients, the sugar or something like that?
So I think it's a few. So inflammation is always a hot topic with depression or mood disorders or anxiety. So we know that ultra-processed foods peripherally and centrally can increase some of that inflammation, which can lead to things like depression, anxiety. I think also a relevant portion is, as you mentioned, the sugar component can be something that's relevant, because we know, specifically within depression, we know insulin resistance, which is something that happens before someone has a full-blown sort of diabetes, can be a predictive factor for developing a depression. And they've done studies looking at different measures of insulin resistance and someone's risk of developing depression, say 5 or 10 years later. This was in the American Journal of Psychiatry. I don't remember the exact author, unfortunately. But yeah, so via the lens of inflammation, via the lens of increased caloric intake, via the lens of sugar and insulin resistance, all of these causative factors come together to contribute to depression. And again, not to say that just eating poor quality foods is going to make you depressed. I mean, it probably can. But couple that with life events and our analogy of the bucket, you can imagine eating all these poor quality foods just fills up your bucket so much more. So when something bad happens, your likelihood of going into depression is just that much higher. So I think there's a lot of factors, a lot of different mechanisms, and it's beyond just the calories that the foods contain.
Gotcha. Yeah. I think I saw another paper that you published about microplastics, which are very prevalent in processed foods, in the packaging and the processing of them. So do those microplastics also have an effect on depression?
Yeah, so to give context for that paper, recently in Nature Medicine, there was a study that looked at the brains of people that had dementia or were healthy and had passed away, and they looked at their brains specifically for the microplastic content. And the shocking finding was that they found a spoon's worth of microplastics within the brain. So that's a large amount. And it was mostly what we call nanoplastics, so the smaller version of that, which makes sense to cross the blood-brain barrier, probably smaller particle. But they also found an association with people with dementia had higher amounts of microplastics in their brain than those without dementia. So that was a very interesting finding because this was one of the first studies that looked at one of the more neurological or psychiatric manifestations of microplastics, whereas other studies looked more at clots and different things like that. So in our paper, what we had posited was perhaps we know that ultra-processed foods, they contain high contents of microplastics. That's because of how they're packaged, how they're processed, and all the different steps that are required to make these foods. And an example that I had cited was chicken nuggets contain 30 times the amount of microplastics compared to chicken breasts. So we can see the orders of magnitude higher of microplastic content in ultra-processed food versus whole foods. And in that, based on what I described before, we know that ultra-processed foods are associated with adverse mental health outcomes like depression and anxiety. We know that ultra-processed foods have higher microplastic content. So what we wrote in that paper was, does this microplastic content mediate the association between ultra-processed food intake and adverse mental health outcomes and even things like dementia? And right now, there's no studies to directly answer that question. And the reason is it's very difficult to study. You can imagine estimating someone's microplastic exposure is very hard. They don't write that on their population-based surveys that people fill out. How many microplastics do you eat a week or something like that versus a general diet? So what we had posited in the paper was potentially making a dietary index called the Dietary Microplastic Index to guesstimate the amount of microplastics in different foods that people are reporting they're eating. And the goal of this would be to then post hoc, you can even, based on existing trials, if the data is available, estimate that. So the randomized control trial that I mentioned about removing ultra-processed foods from someone's diet called the SMILES trial and seeing the depression score change, if there's data to say how much microplastic content was removed by removing the ultra-processed foods, we can kind of get a post hoc analysis to say how much did microplastics mediate this effect. So it's very right now in the air. There's no clear literature linking one to the next, but I think it's a very relevant problem worth studying because, again, as I mentioned, how prevalent microplastics are, how prevalent ultra-processed foods are, and the rising rates of mental health disorders. So it's a question we don't have an answer to, but I think it's a one that hopefully we will in the coming years.
So do the microplastics also then cause inflammation or disrupt some other brain function?
Yeah, so right now, a lot of the studies for microplastics mechanisms are not based on humans. They're based on animal and cell culture studies. So it's always hard to draw one-to-one associations because we know we can't always compare the two from that front. But as you mentioned, it's always a very common link of inflammation, oxidative stress, and different things of this sort, and even different immune-mediated mechanisms that could be implicated in cancers and stuff of that sort. So again, most of it's based on animal cell culture studies, but we're seeing some of these very similar mechanisms that ultra-processed foods have as well too, which again, maybe strengthens that link where we're seeing similar mechanisms between the two, maybe because they are the same thing driving the adverse effects. The question is, number one, how does it even cross the blood-brain barrier? There's not a clear answer. We know that the nanoplastics, which are smaller, typically can get across more, which maybe is a propensity for, just having a hard time getting across smaller particles. There's been some studies looking through the olfactory pathway, so the nose, and getting into the brain via that way. But there's no clear consensus to say how are these microplastics getting into the brain? How do we remove them and things of that sort? So there's a lot of question marks in the space of microplastics, but I think it's a very relevant space.
Gotcha. Yeah, makes sense. But yeah, it might be also that people, or at least, the biggest reason people get microplastics is from processed food mostly. And that is like a confounding variable that people who have more depressive symptoms tend to eat more processed foods as well. So it's a very vicious cycle in every direction.
Yeah, so it's this bidirectional association that, frankly, we'll never be able to fully tease out in terms of which causal factors contributing more. Are people eating more because they're depressed? Or is the ultra-processed foods contributing to that depression? And like I said, I think it goes both ways. It's probably a pretty even split between the two. but it perpetuates this cycle because once you're in that depressed state, once you're eating more of those foods that are potentially causing some more of this damage to your brain, for lack of a better word, it's perpetuating that cycle of eating more foods that are not healthy, replacing those nutrients, remaining in that depressed state. So it's a matter of breaking that cycle. And again, depression isn't just caused by foods, but this is one of the relevant factors that we need to pay attention to.
Gotcha. Are there any other supplements out there besides creatine that show promise for mental health?
Yeah, so one that I'm not... Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so I was going to mention that one thing I did remember seeing from a recent meta-analysis was, I think, that saffron was quite effective. You combined it with other like antidepressants compared to other interventions.
Yeah, so you read my mind there. I was going to say saffron. So by no means am I an expert in saffron, but it was one that I've been keeping my eye on in terms of its effect. They recently did a network meta-analysis looking at different supplements for depression and ranked them. And they found saffron plus an antidepressant had one of the highest benefits. The caveat is that there wasn't a lot of studies, and it seemed to be driven by one study having a larger effect. So when you see that, you want to see more replication to see that, is this consistently happening? And I don't know a whole lot about the mechanism and everything of saffron. It's something that I haven't done a deep dive into yet, but I think it's something that I want to keep my eye on because it's interesting to see its effects. I've seen some literature on saffron, and again, I haven't done a deep dive. Something that's common with antidepressants is even sexual dysfunction after being on an antidepressant. And I saw a paper recently, and I haven't done a full deep dive, looking at saffron for that sexual dysfunction, and it did seem to have some benefits. So I think it's going to be interesting to see more literature on saffron. I think it did seem to come out when they put the studies together. But I think sometimes you get outliers when there's a small study that has a really large effect size. So we need to just kind of be careful in interpreting the results fully. Because I'm not sure if you're aware of there's a meta-analysis for exercise in the BMJ, I think it was a year ago, and dance came out on top. It was a very clear winner above everything else. That's also maybe a similar effect where you're seeing one study that had a really large effect, and there's not a lot of other studies looking at dance and exercise. So that's maybe why. But I'm excited to see more and more research coming out for the saffron literature because I think, again, it's nice to have more options and more adjuncts that you can add to treatment versus our very simplistic, frankly, route of antidepressants or therapy. And even with that, we know the response rates for some people can be around 50%, and then people are deemed to be treatment resistant, and then what sort of thing. So I think saffron's promising, but I want to see more research come out first.
Yeah. With the dancing, it's, I don't think that study was done people on dancing alone. Like they were probably dancing in with other people, which obviously has a very positive effect on mental health. Versus other forms of exercise people tend to do alone, or at least gym and running people tend to do alone, or very rarely in bigger groups.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to that what I mentioned. The social part of exercise is one of the things that we often overlook so much because we see exercise, we think of athletes doing their different fitness routines, and we think of the physical manifestations of exercise of being physically fit in that, but we don't think about just being present with another person or a whole team and how important that is. And, again, removing even exercise, the importance of social connection is just so important beyond your mental health. We know so many outcomes are so much poorer when someone is isolated, even in a physical realm from a cardiac or kidney perspective. So I think it's really important, and it's great that exercise is able to pair some of these antidepressant mechanisms together.
Yeah. You mentioned that depression rates are rising in the world. What are some of the, let's say, biggest things on a government level and individual level we should do to mitigate that?
So I think one of the biggest things, as I mentioned, is emphasis on prevention is one thing. And the other thing is an emphasis on sustained remission. So prevention can be via the lens of lifestyle. It can be via the lens of a lot of other things. So just because we've mostly been speaking about lifestyle, I think we need to facilitate some of these lifestyle parameters a little bit better to the population. So for things like exercise, it would be great as a physician if you could, if someone came with depression, or even not with depression, but it was in this kind of prodromal sort of state that we discussed before, where you could give them a exercise prescription and then that would maybe cause their gym membership to be free, or allow them to get into a different exercise club, or have some fitness training sessions. that may go a long way to help kind of precipitate that person to stay exercising, potentially even prevent a depression, or if they go on to develop a depression, once they are able to get out of that state, to be in a state of sustained remission. I think for diet as well too, right now we need to place a lot of emphasis on making sure that people have high quality foods accessible to them, because we know that there's quite a disparity based on someone's income. So people that have lower income are likely eating more ultra processed foods, and this can also contribute to depressive symptoms. And then things like sleep too, I think stems from a large societal issue of working hours and the amount of commitments that people have just to sustain themselves. An example, even selfishly for myself as a resident right now, working 24-hour call shifts, once a week or so, and some people do it even more often than that, can be pretty detrimental to your sleep. It can be detrimental to your metabolic health. So I think different parameters, even outside of residency, and restrictions in terms of how people work and optimizing their sleep can be very important. And these are all more so through the lens of prevention. But I think through the lens of treatment, specifically exercise, we need to make it possible for physicians to actually prescribe it to patients. I think we often talk about how beneficial exercise is for people, but we don't actually train physicians on how to prescribe it. Most of the time you go to your doctor, whether it's for depression, whether it's for being overweight, if someone tells you go run or go exercise, that's condescending. It's not helpful. You need to have a physician who can speak to you about it and prescribe exercise appropriately. We also need better referral pathways. So if you're a physician that wants to refer someone to exercise, having a referral pathway to a physiotherapist or a personal trainer direct from your clinic to set that patient up right there, similar to the way that you would do if you're referring someone to therapy, we have direct sort of resources. I think those need to be in place. And then the other thing is, on a policy level, we need to have incentives for a physician to want this change. So some discussions that physicians have with patients and they take time, they're financially compensated for it. So if you discuss smoking cessation or different things, then you can be compensated for that time. And I think if we really want change, we need to have some incentives, unfortunately, for the physicians as well to have that discussion, because again, they're in such a time crunch that discussing something like exercise may not be as feasible as here's your prescription for your antidepressant. So I think there's a lot of individual prevention measures, but also policy measures that we can take both, again, at the prevention and treatment level. But there's a lot of steps that we need to take. And I think it starts with education first, because I think there's quite a disconnect between, we know the benefits of exercise, we know all these different things, but we still don't do it. It's even in the guidelines, but we still don't do it well. So clearly there's a disconnect that we need to address.
Yeah, that's interesting. And what about the individual level? Should they, obviously many people already know what they need to do, exercise and sleep enough and etc. Is there anything like specific?
Yeah, so what on the individual level, specifically, like it goes back to the education lens. So yeah, you're right. A lot of people know, exercise more, sleep, optimize sleep, but it's not always possible. I think at the individual level with the physician in your office, what you can actually do is prescribe that exercise appropriately. So some of the parameters that we spoke about in prescribing exercise, we need to do the same thing as we do for medication. So if you go to your doctor and you're started on an antidepressant, they're going to tell you the antidepressant, they're going to tell you the dose, they're going to tell you the route you're taking it, they're going to tell you how often to take it, they're going to tell you side effects, all these different things, right? But you go to your doctor and on an individual level, they say, go exercise. We need to make a more of a formalized sort of prescription to communicate with your patient and also track benefits, side effects, etc. So we've developed, or we wrote about actually the FIT principle, which puts together some of the things that we said before. So it's FITT, so frequency, intensity, type, and time. So that breaks exercise down into a prescription. And you can actually write that down within your notes or to the patient, the different exercise parameters that you've discussed, and that the patient can hopefully try to adhere to. So therefore, at your next appointment, when you come in and they say, this is really working for me, I've noticed a benefit in my depression, or maybe the frequency was too high, can we lower that a little bit? You can actually facilitate that discussion. So I think at that individual level, we need to do a better job at speaking to our patients in an actionable way that can result in changes in someone's habits of exercise. And hopefully have some of those policy level changes to facilitate it too.
Yeah, that's a very important component, I think. Well, yeah, it's been a great talking with you, and before I ask my last question, where can people learn more about you and your work?
Well, thank you for having me. And yeah, I think I'm mostly active on X or Twitter. I'm trying to be a little bit more active on Instagram now too. This is the same handle, so it's NT Fabiano. I try to, on my X at least, write about an article like once a day sort of thing and kind of break it down. So if you're interested in hearing about exercise or any other things like that, feel free to check me out. But yeah, thank you for having me.
Well, it's great, and I'll put the links in the show notes. My last question is, what's this one piece of advice or a habit that you wish you adopted sooner?
I think the piece of advice that that's a good question. I think implementing exercise as a part of your day rather than an addition. So it's something that you need to do within your day. It's part of your day. It's similar to kind of going to work, and not from that dependency lens, but to say, this is part of my day. I've reserved an hour to exercise, and I'm going to respect that, because it's very easy to forget that your day gets busy. You need to have all these other tasks to do. But if you really cement it in your day and say, this hour is reserved for my self-care of exercise or whatever it may be, I think setting that aside goes a long way, because your life only gets busier as you get older and school and different responsibilities. So I think my piece of advice is set that hour aside, whether it's for exercise, whether it's for anything else, that's time for you, because your life will never stop getting busy. You need to take that time for yourself.
Yeah, that's I agree. Well, thanks for coming to the show. It was great to talk, and yeah, I'll see you around.
Okay, thank you for having me.
Alright, that's it for this episode. Make sure you check out my new book, The Longevity Leap, on Amazon. I'd also appreciate if you share this episode with a friend or family member. Other than that, my name is Siim. Stay tuned for the next episode. Stay empowered.